Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to share a bit of my research as well as some general thoughts about or like introduction to like the basics of the field. I'd say of what I'm studying here in Oxford. I'm a fourth year PhD student. I'm working with Christopher Summerfield in the Department of Experimental Psychology, and my research is at what I think a really cool and interesting intersection between neuroscience, cognitive science, psychology, and artificial intelligence. Yeah, so thanks everyone so much for coming, and I'm really excited to share just a bit of that. Maybe before we get started, just so that I can gauge roughly the time to spend on different parts, I'm curious to hear from the audience, um, or do you can just put a hand up, like who here would feel confident like explaining how a neural network works? Um, okay, so not many people. That's good because this is like an introductory talk. So yeah, hopefully we can work on that a bit today. And who here has like some background or like prior knowledge in like neuroscience and like how neural networks from like biological neural networks maybe work? A few hands. Okay, great. So hopefully this talk will be interest. There'll be like some new stuff for everyone here on one side or the other side. Um, this is a huge topic, neural networks and minds and machines. It's also a very current topic. So there's lots of research, many new things being published every single day, which can make it quite hard to kind of like keep up on all of the developments. Um, but there's also a lot of really fascinating insights that this field has gained, and so we can take a bit of like a step back here and look at some of the like more like fundamental questions, like similarities and kind of like large trends. Um, there are three questions which I'd like to go through today, and I think if we touch on all of these, then I'll be very happy with the way that the talk has gone, and hopefully there'll be some new things there for everyone. The first is the question like, as cognitive psychologists or cognitive scientists, why should we study AI? Like, what is the relevance of artificial intelligence to psychology and neuroscience? Then, second, what do neural networks do, or how do they work? Thinking a bit more about artificial neural networks here, but also some of the similarities with biological neural networks. And then finally, I'd like to share just a bit about my own research, which is zooming in on more on this particular phenomenon of cognitive flexibility in minds and machines. And I'll hope to get, explain that in a bit more detail later on. So first, the three reasons why I think um, a cognitive psychologist or a cognitive from the perspective of cognitive science, it makes sense to study artificial intelligence and develop kind of this interest. The first and most obvious one, which I suspect is also a reason that many people are here, is that AI may drastically reshape our society in the coming years. Some say that this process has already begun. Um, while deep learning has kind of a long history, it's really with the release of ChatGPT that these tools have become much more accessible and have started really shaping the way that many of us engage with each other, with kind of the accumulated base of knowledge, interact in the online world, and so forth. AI has brought many impressive advances over time. Uh, Going back to perhaps the 1950s was like the early beginnings, where you had the first computer that was capable of playing checkers at a reasonably high level. But you can see that since then, a long period passed where progress was still relatively slow. In 1997, we have Deep Blue beating Kasparov at chess. Um, and it's only recently that progress has begun to accelerate. And you can see the dots between these different milestones becoming shorter and shorter as time goes on. 2007, deep networks rivaled humans on image recognition challenges. 2016, uh, finally a computer was able to beat the human world champion at Go. And it's since 2022 with the release of ChatGPT that we've seen also AI starting to move more into this language domain and taking over more and more tasks there. There's a lot of debate around this, around like uh, of course, predicting how these trends will play out further into the future. But some things that people always like to point to are these things called scaling laws. Um, so which essentially try to extrapolate trends in how these AI systems are developed over time, to kind of predict what capabilities we might have in the future. Um, as we'll go through in the talk today, um, AI systems are built out of these different networks that have different computational powers and different sizes. And you can see here that if you plot an exponential, kind of like a logarithmic plot over time, you can see the way that these systems are just becoming bigger, larger, and larger and larger, with some potential, with, of course, the thought being that it's unclear how much further, where you can extrapolate this exponential curve. Some say much, much further. Of course, there are always others who say not so much further. I won't take a side in this argument, but yeah, there's this, at least for the past 15 years or so, a certain amount of like trends that you have of data to like back on. In particular, at the current point, there's also this other side, which is the business side, which is that money is being poured into AI, at an ever increasing rate. This chart shows the gross growth of a $1,000 investment in Nvidia. If we could go back and make that investment in 2014, that would be quite fortunate for all of us. And this chart cuts off in 2024, but of course, it's continued maybe not quite as rapidly, but still continued to grow since then. The second large point, rather than the importance that AI is having in our society, is this idea that cognitive psychology and neuroscience and kind of these tools of studying intelligent behavior and of trying to figure out how networks can coordinate to produce cognition and other forms of intelligent behavior can help us also understand AI. So is there a way that we can use the same set of tools or the same way of reasoning about these topics, and apply them to these artificial systems to try to get a better handle of how they work and where the limits of their capabilities might be? And you can see here is one tweet of a job posting by Anthropic, coming out a few years ago, well, 1 year ago in 2025, saying that Anthropic is organizing an AI psychiatry team, which is really trying to take this quite literally of researching the kind of personas in AI agents using tools that take this direct inspiration from kind of psychological and neuroscientific research. There are also other kinds of review papers and these kinds of sources that you can look up online that go through how the toolbox of tools from neuroscience and psychology of studying intelligent behavior at different levels of analysis. So from a computational level, asking what behavior an algorithm is trying to accomplish, to an algorithmic level, thinking more about how it accomplishes these things particularly. On all of these different levels, psychology and neuroscience has tried to figure out the way that the brain is processing and is performing computations. And there's some inspiration or some parallel between the tools that are being used in AI currently at the same time. There's also a lot of ongoing research, in particular when it becomes to these larger neural networks like GPT, in taking classic experiments from cognitive psychology directly and using them to intervene and like try to figure out how large language models work. Here, this is one. This study here is taking a very classic question from the psychology literature that tries to study the decision-making biases in people, to then apply it to GPT. And the result that they find in this and many similar papers is that large language models exhibit many similar biases in decision-making and judgment as humans do, although there are many differences in behavior as well. And so we can think about the relationship where the large language models, of course, are trained in some way to predict or to simulate human responses as perhaps being indicative here. They'll take up some parts of human behavior, but not others. And these kinds of tests can be useful to figure out where the limits of that are. And then third, we can go the other way. So we can say in AI algorithms, we have kind of a formal model in some sense um, of how of of systems that can behave intelligently to some extent. And so this fact that we can now build systems capable of performing certain actions in this very controlled online environment is also something that we can use to kind of formalize hypotheses we might have about the brain or that we might have about psychology, and in essence trying to see if we can like implement them in artificial neural networks or similar kinds of algorithms and see how our predictions pan out over time. And if we formalize them like that, these networks here are built up of this artificial neural networks, which we'll spend a good deal amount of time talking about later, are built up out of many of these individual nodes, which are supposed to be formal abstractions of neurons in the brain, which are kind of the fundamental building block of how we think our brain gives rise to these very complicated and intelligent computations that we can do. And so in some sense, the original artificial neural networks were developed very much as models for how computation can be distributed across these many different nodes, and how that can give rise to very complicated forms of behavior, which perhaps is not obvious at the outset. AI systems and the brain solve similar problems. This is one one reason that many people point to as pointing to the fact that perhaps there is some similarity in the way that the two could function. And the problem ultimately is this of having to take some input, some kind of like stimulation from or sensory perception from the outside world, processing that in the brain or in an artificial neural network algorithm, and then afterwards translating that stimulus into some kind of behavior, or perhaps can be external or internal, like updating your memory, something like that, but generating some kind of like response that we can measure. There are parallel concepts that exist in AI and neuroscience, kind of a parallel language that describe many of the same things. So a neuroscientist might be talking about like brain areas, cell types, neural codes, or cognitive constructs. An AI scientist or engineer would talk about cost functions, constraints, architectures, or optimization procedures when describing how their system works. And so, yeah, these are parallel concepts, but I think there's a lot to be gained from trying to think about relating these to each other. The field in neuroscience, which takes AI as a pretty literal model of the brain building up in these networks, is called neuroconnectionism, where we hear, for instance, and we'll talk about this a bit more as well, you can roll out these like neural network architectures and study representations in the brain that you can record, again, through activation firing patterns of these small neurons, and then compare how an artificial neural network processes the information or what kinds of representations arise with that of a neural network, with that of the biological brain. Kind of putting this all together, there's this famous principle which this kind of aspect all takes inspiration from. This quote from Richard Feynman here: "What I cannot create, I do not understand." Kind of the challenge to neuroscience as a field, that to really understand something, if you really want to show that you have an understanding of how the brain performs a certain behavior or a certain computation, one way of demonstrating this understanding is to build it in an artificial system. Of course, it won't necessarily prove exactly how the brain works, but if you are unable to build it, perhaps that's a sign that there is something missing in the model. There's something that you don't really understand. This relationship between the two fields, AI on the one hand and psychology and neuroscience on the other, has been called the virtuous circle of AI and neuroscience, where AI can provide a way to simulate processes in the brain, and on the other hand, things we learn about the way that the brain works can provide inspiration for um, developing AI algorithms further. So this is the first block of questions. We can go on to the second one. I've already mentioned neural networks a few times. I'm sure you've all heard the word before, at least in some contexts. So now let's move forward and try to take a deeper dive into how neural networks actually work. So AI systems and the brain, as I mentioned before, solve similar problems. They both have this fundamental relationship of taking in a sensory stimulus or um, something like that from the outside world, then processing that in some way through some implementing ideally in essence some kind of like function, and this then giving rise to a behavior in the outside world, like some kind of like response that we can measure, like for instance pressing the green button or the red button in a neuroscience or psychology experiment as a response to kind of a grading pattern that you see. A standard problem in, at least in the machine learning world, even though for people it's so simple we very rarely even think about it, is recognizing handwritten digits. And so there are data sets online that have um, these pictures of handwritten digits, very simple out here. And a classic machine learning task is to classify these digits. So take in like pixels representing your picture, and to somehow have an algorithm that can translate this into like a digital representation. So now like the number 5 you would type on a keyboard. And even still today, even though this is a very simple task, if you just want to kind of like validate your machine learning pipeline or you're working on a new algorithm, this data set called MNIST is still one of the first places many machine learning researchers will go to kind of like test that their system works or to benchline it, as it's a very common, like stable, well-researched kind of like data set. We can think for 1 second about how the brain kind of would solve this problem. The brain has specialized neural systems, of course, to process visual input. You have neurons on the retina that will take in some firing and then pass this on over a series of different kind of like connections and interneurons over to higher visual areas in cortex where we think that the processing actually occurs and give rise to recognition and behavior. These pathways work through the interconnection of many different individual units of these neurons. Maybe I'll turn on the laser pointer here. And you can show through physiological studies that these neurons will communicate using something called or action potentials, or at least fire in that process information in that way, where one of these units will be connected to many other sources here, and if it's stimulated enough, then it'll give rise to this very binary kind of like firing pattern where you can measure a change in electric current as this stimulus is passed from the dendrite side over to the synapses, and then releases neurotransmitters that can stimulate in turn other neurons further down the pathway. So fundamentally, that was a bit abstract, but fundamentally what we can say is that neurons work by integrating information from many sources. This, of course, on the left is a bit more like a slightly more realistic image, not particularly. But But we can see here then on the right hand side like an abstraction dating all the way back to 1943 of what this kind of processing in essence does, where you can imagine the dendrites, these parts of the neuron here, receiving input, so changes in voltage that are due to taking up neurotransmitters in their connections or other kinds of stimulation, so that, for instance, like visual stimulation in our retina, in essence, take up this kind of information, aggregate it in the soma, so this part of the neuron in the center, and if there is enough of a stimulation, this results in this kind of like action potential spike, which corresponds to the transmission of the signal from the soma all the way here to the connections, the synapses with other neurons. And this very simple algorithm, or this very simple kind of like abstraction of this neural network, gives rise to, in essence, the building blocks of our modern machine learning architectures. A few years later, so this is like 1957 is the reference, there's this McCulloch's and Pitts neuron was developed further into an algorithm that could take that could actually learn, but fundamentally worked in the same way. So this is now an abstraction moving where we now, instead of picturing dendrites that connect to other neurons or take some kind of like stimulation in the outside world through other sources, we now imagine the connections to this network consisting of different like numbers in essence. So a network will take in like a series of numbers x1, x2, all the way down to xn, and then a 1 at the end. And with this, each of these numbers, the way that this neuron works in broad strokes is it just takes each of these numbers, multiplies them by a different number, so x1 times w1, x2 times w2, all the way down xn times wn, sums them up, and then just checks, is this output, like this weighted sum that I've computed here, is it larger than the threshold or is it smaller than the threshold? And if it's larger than the threshold, it passes out a 1 on the outside here. If it's smaller than the threshold, it outputs a 0. And so you can really see how this is like a theoretical abstraction of the process we just described before, of a neuron that is connected to other neurons, takes in stimulation from their neurotransmitters, aggregates that in the soma, and then either produces an action potential or passing on information to other neurons as a result, or doesn't. And so this neuron in and of itself is already sufficient to make very simple decisions through the process that I've just described. For instance, we could imagine passing in an image, representing this image as a set of different numbers, which always happens behind the scenes and on the computer if you look at a digital image, multiplying this with different weights, and then producing this true or false decision on the basis of some threshold, can be 0 or something like that. However, now the question is this simple algorithm, like, is a single neuron sufficient to solve a task like the MNIST task, which I described, of kind of like in essence, forming this kind of classification between these different units here. And this is where, in essence, the magic begins to happen. A single perceptron itself, just by itself, is not capable of performing such a more complicated task. We can describe the set of tasks that a perceptron can solve as linearly separable. So if we imagine having two sets of inputs, or although it could be like a more high-dimensional space, like you can have n different inputs, but imagine like each input that you picture can correspond to like a single point here, or a single like dot or something like that, in this high-dimensional space. And now imagine in a classification task where we want to decide between two different categories. These different dots would correspond to different colors. Um, and the class of tasks that the perceptron can solve are exactly those tasks where you can take your two different clusters or your two different classes in this space and separate them by a single line or like a single hyperplane in like a more high dimensional space, but essentially just like one straight kind of like object without any kinds of like curves or rotations or something like that. Um, so we can imagine this particular representation here, and then oppose that with like linearly inseparable problems, which are essentially all of these other categories. So for instance, this one where the decision boundary, you can see there's still a lot of structure in the task. Like there clearly like all of the red class belongs in this center region and all of the green ones are outside. But the dividing boundary isn't a straight line. Rather, it's this like very curved kind of like division. Another example of like a linearly inseparable task is one where where you can divide it with straight lines, but you need two of them and not a single straight line. Um, and or for instance, this one here where there's like a more complicated shape and still some structure, but it's a bit imperfect. And there's like a data point far out in the red that's like in the green one. So you can think about, if you want, like a single perceptron with like this like threshold function as representing like a single straight line in some high dimensional space of like inputs to outputs. It's an interesting historical point that this limitation, or like a critique of the limitations of the perceptron, namely this realization that a single one of these neurons would never be able to solve more complicated tasks, led to the first AI winter. So this is like a period in history where perhaps between 1950, which I described as like the starting point in much of AI history, to 1970 or so, there was a lot of research and engagement in the field. But then from 1973 to 1980, there was really like a step back where it felt like not that much was happening. There wasn't as much excitement. And then from there, after 1980, it started taking up again. But we can see that there was even a second AI winter after 1988, which then gradually transitioned out. And yeah, it's a question if we will have another AI winter or if we're past that at the moment, because yeah, this certainly feels like a boom time, I guess, right now, but historically not the first one. So in order to now let's think about like the solution essentially of how we can solve these problems that a single neuron can't solve comes from using many different individual neurons together in concert, and aggregating them into like a larger network. So let's think about like the way that this could work. So imagine that we have like a two-dimensional space here with these two different categories of these blue dots and these red dots. In a 2D space, they might not be linearly solvable because linearly separable, because you would have to draw this like curved line through there. However, it's possible that you can expand this space into a third dimension, for instance, where you then, in this third dimension, because you're distinguishing them based on some other piece of information or some additional point, it then becomes possible to separate them out in this linear manner. And so in neural networks, you can accomplish this kinds of expansion of the space, in essence, through adding additional neurons. So we can take this like input neuron here, and we, instead of going straight to an output, we have several different hidden layers in the middle, which can transform the space in yeah, in various different ways. So it's like, for instance, through like scrunching bits of information together, through making some feature like a lot more important in a certain region, etc. Um, and so you can show, and this is essentially what led to the end of this or what led the path forward for neural networks is that if you add in enough of these individual units, you can learn to approximate any function through setting the correct like weights, essentially, with like arbitrary precision. So theoretically, these neural networks can represent any kind of like function or computation that you would want. Um, and so, yeah, now you can see we haven't talked about the learning process yet. We'll talk about that in just a second. But um, yeah, in essence, once you string these together, you can then take a neural network on MNIST and train it. And you can see that the loss curve, so this is the error rate of the neural network here on the y-axis, goes down pretty quickly as the network is exposed to more and more of the data. Interestingly, at the end of the training, you can look at the misclassified patterns. So what are the handwritten digits that the neural network does wrong? And you can see that many of the mistakes that the neural network makes are ones where some of them we would also go and say, well, this digit isn't particularly clear. Like I don't know why this is a 3, for instance, or something like that. And so in some sets, yeah, you can also study, for instance, the misclassification patterns of neural networks and try to figure out how human-like or unhuman-like are these. So now the question, of course, the magic is how can we find the weights? So all of the information about what function a neural network is implementing, and a particular neuron is implementing even more so, is in the set of these like W's, which we described before, that describe how strongly that node is connected to other nodes in the network. Um, so um, once you have that ideal set, the network can solve any function. However, the difficulty in using these algorithms lies in finding that correct combination of the weights. And this is accomplished using something called supervised learning. Um, in essence, supervised learning is a form of like error-based learning. So you start off with like a random combination of the W parameters, make a prediction based on what you have, and then you check how close was my prediction to the correct value. And you then can figure out like how much, if there was some error associated, how much each individual like weight between the different networks was responsible for that mistake, and change it a tiny bit so that the mistake becomes less likely or smaller in the future. So in essence, supervised learning calculates the error for a given example and adjusts the network parameters, so these like W's, to decrease it based on a learning rule. Of course, an important note here is that this requires like some ground truth data set. The network needs like a teaching signal or something like that that can tell it like how to direct, how to make these modifications in its parameters in order to learn. And so then this ultimately updates the weights according to the gradient. The gradient is a term you might also hear, but it essentially just means the rate of change in your error or your loss with respect to these like weights. And so you have here's the closed form for what this like weight update looks like in one space, but you can then couple this back and send the error back over many different layers or alternate connections in the neural network through various different architectures. But it all is fundamentally the same principle of first starting out with some random combination of these weights, like more or less random, making a first prediction, seeing what your error is, and then translating that backwards. And yeah, there's, of course, this particular learning algorithm is still quite distant from the way that we think that the brain works. So that the brain learns, of course. We also think that many parts of the brain function through error-driven learning of one shape or another. Of course, we can learn on the basis of external feedback or something like that about what we're doing correct or incorrect. However, this algorithm itself requires a lot of global structure about the way that the network is connected architecturally. And so this is an ongoing connection in the field. Like, how much does the actual learning correspond between the two systems? At a high level, however, there are many areas where the result of the training reveals a lot of similarities. So even though you may not get there the same way, you might still have similar processing that comes through these very different kinds of learning processes. And so this is like very much an ongoing research area, is trying to figure out exactly how close is this like learning algorithm that I've just described to the learning that occurs in the brain, and how similar or dissimilar is the result, and so forth. However, I do find it very useful to have this as a mental model, at least in the end, the finished product of thinking about how it's possible also in the brain that we have these many, like this network buildup of many individual units that can give rise to all of the behavior that we perform. So finally, this is like I mean, of course, this is like a massive field. I think, yeah, I would fail to do justice in any way of like describing, trying to describe like the whole history. And so for the final section, I just wanted to talk a tiny bit about my own research, which is studying cognitive flexibility. And in particular, I'm going to be presenting results from this paper here, which I wrote along with two other like friend PhD students of mine, about like task abstractions in neural networks. So first, what is cognitive flexibility? So cognitive flexibility is a broad term describing the set of abilities that our brain has to respond to change in the environment. I have here a representation of a Wisconsin card sorting test, which is a classic test in the psychological literature, that is used to measure things like cognitive flexibility in studies of psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia and so forth. The way this test works is that an experimenter will lay down 4 different cards here, like for instance the one with the 2 red triangles, the star 2 and so forth, and then give the participant 1 additional card, which for instance will have 3 triangles here. And without giving any additional instruction about like what the rule is or something like that, the participant has to take this additional card and sort it onto one of these piles. So it has to figure out what's the mapping between these 3 triangles here and these 4 cards. And you can see in this particular example that there are 3 different, or in general, there are always going to be 3 different ways that the card can be sorted. It could be sorted, for instance, on the basis of shapes. So this would be putting the triangles together. So this on the 1. On the basis of color, so this would be putting the card on the 2. Or on the basis of number, so this would be putting these 3 together here with the 4. And so the participant in this Wisconsin card sorting test will also need to learn what the rule is through essentially an error-driven process. So after they sort the card, the experimenter will tell them correct or incorrect before giving them another card. And so the participant will kind of play with this. And then the really tricky part is that at some point, without giving any kind of cue to the participant, the experimenter will switch the rule and start giving entirely different feedback. So whereas before we could have been operating in the color paradigm and sort this 3 onto this 2 here, at some point the experimenter will just switch it and start giving feedback corresponding to the like number paradigm or something like that. And what we're interested to in these studies in psychology is essentially assessing how responsive is the participant to this feedback, how many iterations does it take them to change their behavior, and once they have changed their behavior, how quick are they at finding the new solution, and so forth. And there's a lot of literature that says that or that also studies the way that this task and these different, in particular, these different kinds of like contexts that the brain needs to switch back and forth here are implemented in the brain. And like, yeah, prefrontal cortex and thalamus are two particular areas that people believe are responsible for this kind of modulation of activity based on these like or kind of suppression of what you knew was the right action in one context and switching to a different set of behaviors and so forth in another context. And we won't look too much at all of that here in the last few minutes, but yeah, try to remain at this more abstract level. When it comes to this task, something which you might see in humans is that as we progress through different blocks, so through these like different iterations of switching the rule and so forth, people will learn to solve the task more and more quickly. So whereas the first time when they don't have any experience with this task, they'll take a long time to figure out that there is a certain mapping. If you switch the task once, they'll be on average faster the second time to figure out like, A, there has been a switch, and B, what's like the new mapping that I'm supposed to work with, and so forth. And this trend kind of continues until towards the end, participants don't need a lot of trial and error to figure out what they're supposed to do once there has been an underlying rule switch. However, interestingly, at least these like smaller neural networks that people have studied for a longer time as models in cognitive psychology really struggle with this kind of change. This is something called catastrophic forgetting in the field, where you can see that if you train a neural network on one task and then switch the task at some point, the neural network will tend to forget what it previously learned over time, and it doesn't seem to be able to like protect and like gate this information in the same way that people can. The way that this is usually solved in machine learning is in essence through trying to provide like some kind of context signal and making out of these like three or four different tasks, one large task, and teach them all to the neural network at the same time. And if you show that you can show that if you do this, the neural network will tend to learn well and can solve these like different tasks without them competing with one another. However, this is a bit of an interesting fact because we also know that people work actually best when learning several tasks if they're a bit separated in time. So rather than learning like all different foreign languages in the same like class, it's better to first have like French for 1 hour and then like Spanish in the second hour and so forth. And so in this paper, the way that we tried to get like even a simple neural network to be able to solve this task is by building a network that had something that had like an architecture which was specialized to pick up on these different components. So you can imagine two different populations of neurons, which both have a single kind of like readout weight here that's multiplied together. But otherwise, it's entirely still like a very normal neural network. And then we have these like randomly generated tasks. And because it's a normal neural network, we can train it using backpropagation. So the same algorithm that I described before. And we now want to study like these like readout weights here. Our hypothesis was that they can in essence like learn to form like some kind of like implicit like gating strategy or some kind of implicit like context mechanism that could get the network to protect like what it's learned in one of these tasks and switch to another task without like forgetting everything, even without providing an external signal. So we can formalize this by looking at it in like this chart here, where we can see, we can imagine the neural network operating between two different regimes. One of them we call the flexible regime, which is exactly this, where the two different populations of the neurons correspond to two different tasks, and the readout weights, like the weights that go to the output, simply like up or down regulate the two. So they're in essence choosing which of these two tasks to solve. And we can oppose this with something called the forgetful regime, where um, we can imagine both populations of the neurons will tracking the active task and learning to represent whatever the current task is that the network is to solve it. And here the readout weights are not providing this particular special role. So we have these two different facts here. And we then try to figure out in the paper what are the different factors that will determine whether a neural network finds this like more flexible mode of switching or sticks in this other one. And we identify three kind of components. So one is like fast units, another one is units that are a bit of like finite size, so that don't grow indefinitely, and three that have kind of a like a blocked task structure during training. So we want to give the neural network enough time to like learn one particular task before going on to the next one. Yeah, I'll go through the next slides a bit quickly, just to give you an idea, keeping an eye on the time. But what we can in essence see is that if we supply the network with these three different factors, so these like differential learning rules and other things meant to make the network be a bit more biological at a high level, the network successfully learns how to gate this information and switches back and forth more and more quickly over time, as opposed to the case where we don't do that, when no matter how often you switch between these different tasks, the network isn't learning more quickly. Yeah, we then show that this can generalize to different kinds of tasks, like it can aggregate information from different environments. And we also characterize the learning using feedback. And ultimately, yeah, we then also see these human-like patterns where the more the network has been exposed to different tasks, the more and more rapid this switching behavior occurs over time. In essence, this means that the neural network has learned emergently to do something called like context-dependent gain control, where it's modifying how much it learns or how much it updates based on the error in different neural parameters on the basis of the current context. And we've shown that this can happen emergently, not necessarily in like regular neural networks, but with certain architectural modifications that we think are kind of parallel or might be very, very loosely like parallel to more biological neurons. We then show that neural networks exist with, I mean, of course, this is moving on, like taking a step back. Of course, neural networks nowadays exist in many, many different shapes and can solve like more and more complex tasks. So like large language models, for instance, fundamentally are trained through this process called next token prediction, where you start the network off with like some string, like the students open their, and the network in essence has to fill in the blanks. So supply like books, laptops, exams, or minds. And you can see how in essence this is a task which you can learn on the basis of error and feedback with the environment, the same way you can the more simple tasks, and so many of the same learning algorithms apply. However, it does require like networks that aren't as simple as the ones I described, but work through more kind of like complicated connections and interactions, such as like recurrent neural networks that are connected with themselves, and like intention and transformer networks more famously, which kind of are like the next generation of architecture for these kinds of sequence tasks. And we can look at all of these different kinds of neural networks and also factor them into different classes of models for cognitive flexibility. And so here are just a few of these different kinds, which have different amounts of like structure built in and different kinds of interpretability, from these like very, very large, like large language model networks to these like very fine networks like we looked at in our paper, where you can try to tease apart more what is happening and how the neural network is solving the task. Um, yeah, so one additional example here is we also used like some of these more complicated recurrent neural network architectures to study how, or to like formalize hypotheses for how people might take into account like different kinds of error from the environment and update on the basis of that very selectively. So also these more complicated networks are finding a use or many uses in the field. Um, so that's what I have as an initial talk. Thank you so much for your attention, and yeah, we still have time for questions. And thanks also to um, the lab that I'm in here, and also yeah, I wanted to shout out quickly my supervisor's Professor Christopher Summerfield, and he also has like a website which has like a lot of the like which has like a lot of his like course content materials online, and also like one or two slides are from there. So it's I recommend it as a good source, and you might recognize them. That's it. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
So are you essentially saying that, like, to achieve artificial general intelligence, the difference between our brains and AGI is essentially an architectural issue around neural networks, and if you get the architecture right, that will enable us to achieve AGI?
Um, I I wouldn't say that necessarily. I think it's more complicated than just the architecture. Um, like um, yeah. So ultimately, the knowledge that a network has is stored in the weights, right? So these connections. Um, and I think something which is like very important, for instance, is that uh, our brains represent like structure in a very like semantically meaningful way. So they kind of you can show that individual neurons will like correspond to like certain patterns in the environment, or like for instance like different like light sensitivities and so forth at a very basic level, but also like more sophisticated concepts like more abstractly. Um, and and so I think like a lot of the difference comes from like the richness of like these like representations and how like structured knowledge is, which can lead to like much more yeah, which will lead to like richer representations and like generalization to different tasks. Um, and so I think it's I would argue it's like more about like those things than the architecture, because you can imagine many different architectures being able to solve like um, the same task, um, and but different architectures might have like a harder or easier time at like finding the right like connections and the right structure, if that makes sense. Um, yeah, I don't know who's next. Uh,
So this is a really basic question. I'm going to
of
reveal
course.
my ignorance, but I mean, I always thought that neural network was a piece of hardware that was modeled on the architecture of the brain, whereas a large language model, the architecture is something different, isn't it? It's not the hardware, but
Right.
it's more the structure of the multi-dimensional field of words and language and so on. It just
Yeah.
seems a bit odd to be mapping the architecture of the brain onto something that isn't the physical architecture. So the hardware software.
No, I think that's a great question. So in essence, um, yeah, in essence, like a neural network um, is usually simulated on kind of like a regular CPU or GPU, so it doesn't really have any like specialized hardware. Like if you look at, for instance, well, I guess we can look at this diagram here. Um, like all the network is, at the end of the day, it's just a way of like representing what is like a sequence of different like computations in the network, right? So it's like taking one set of numbers as an input, like multiplying these with like another set of numbers, and then applying like some kind of like threshold or like other kinds of activation there, and then passing that on to the next layer and so forth. Um, and so yeah, ultimately like like a neural network is more like an algorithm or like more like a concept than it is like an actual like physical thing in that sense. And so you can process these computations on all kinds of different hardware. Many of the advances in neural networks, because as I showed here, like many of these basic algorithms are quite old. Like a lot of the advancements has come from us being able to build more specialized hardware that can perform these kinds of large like multiplications faster and faster and like more efficiently. Um, and so that's where um, uh, so that's like something where the hardware certainly like plays a role in like how these neural networks are developed. Um, you, but there's no like fundamental difference. I don't know if that like answers the
So this
question.
is why I call them neural networks, I guess. It just
Right.
seems like it's the hardware is agreeing that might maybe in mind works completely differently
Yeah.
than the hardware. So it just seems an odd to call it
Yes.
a neural network. I was surprised that was being called that.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It can be a bit too like hard to wrap your head around. I do think that in many ways it is like a bit of like just like an analogy or like a metaphor or something like that more than anything specific. But if you think about it as like a network of individual units, yeah, then it's one way to start trying to figure out like what the how it like accomplishes these like calculations. Let's say. I don't know if that satisfies. Yeah. Um,
Thanks. You referenced fast learning neurons in one of the architectural solutions to make a flexible model. Are these neurons that presumably they accrue evidence about the task state and then they weight the rest of the model to bias it towards behaving in a way that is like one task or like the other task? Is that what you're suggesting here? I didn't.
yeah, that's a great intuition. That's like exactly what you described is ultimately what we find. So these like set of like readout weights is learn in this ultimately behave like you say, where over time they kind of behave a bit randomly, but then at some point they switch to very precisely representing like which of the tasks is currently active. So going from, for instance, like just kind of these random fluctuations to switching on and off very precisely as the network learns goes from solving one task to solving the other task. And so one part of that is the fact that these networks can learn very quickly, so that they kind of are able to protect the knowledge that is learned in the other networks. Yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. I'm very curious, are we stuck with the backpropagation algorithm or are there some alternatives to that? And the same question, and a very similar question, are we stuck with the computers, the electronic computers, or are there different computational systems, biological, I don't know, chemical?
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's a great question. And also very like active like topics of debate and like research in the field. I would say. So there certainly are many other kinds of like learning algorithms that people have studied. In particular, in the field, people have an interest in what are called like quote unquote biologically plausible learning algorithms. So as I mentioned, we don't think that backpropagation is something that you can the brain could directly be doing, because in essence like an individual node only has access to like local information in the brain, so it only knows like what the nodes that are like directly connected to it are doing. But in order to do backpropagation, like every node in essence has to know the whole like architecture and the whole set of connections in order to figure out how much it should update. And so yeah, there's like a very ongoing field of like trying to build these algorithms which might learn in like a more brain-like manner. Um, However, um, backpropagation is by far still like the industry standard if you want to like develop any kind of like application. Yeah, because in a computer we have access to this global information, it kind of makes sense to use it if what you care about is like solving a task as efficiently as possible, as opposed to like modeling like something that could be happening in the brain. And there's a similar, I'd say, similar trend on the hardware side, where people are also developing something called like neuromorphic engineering, is like this field of trying to build like hardware which maybe functions in a bit more like biologically realistic way. But there also, I'd say, the current status is it's like a very interesting field of research, and there certainly are signs of like progress and potential, but it's certainly not like the industry standard in that sense.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. You seem to focus on supervised learning models where sort of the idea is that intelligence is based off of rational decision making or something similar. I'm wondering if unsupervised learning models could tell us more about something like the default neural network in creativity, where maybe the weights are something that's more unpredictable, or something similar to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Like you pointed out, so supervised learning is kind of, well, it's probably is like the simplest way to build this like a learning algorithm into a neural network. This is the case where you have like this ground truth telling you like what the correct function is from a training set. But there certainly are other kinds of learning algorithms. Like for instance, unsupervised learning is one where you have an algorithm that is just trying to figure out like patterns in the data and do things like, what sets of my inputs are like more similar or like dissimilar, how many different like clusters could there be, that kind of stuff. And so this is very much like also, I would say, like an ongoing and like active field of research. To what extent are those like unsupervised algorithms or other kinds of algorithms like reinforcement learning algorithms, like more or less like brain-like? There's a lot of literature I'd be happy to share or like talk more afterwards.
We've got time for this as the last question.
Thank you. Are you able to say anything about how algorithm designers deal with sort of hidden biases in the training data, such as gender and racial bias?
Yeah. So yeah, this is something which I think is really, really important when we think about like the societal impacts of algorithms and like artificial intelligence and so forth. And so in essence, like what I've described here is like a way that an algorithm can learn to approximate like the data that we have, right? So in text, it'll learn to like reproduce the text that is in the training data. Or also if you train like a neural network on the basis of like hiring decisions, then the neural network will also frequently learn to like pick up on these biases that might exist in like past hiring decisions and kind of like apply them to new ones and so forth. And so this is, I think, like a really, really big problem. And yeah, I don't think there is a good solution so far in that sense. There are things you can do to try to like correct like to try to like compensate or kind of like change, like artificially augment your data set or something like that. However, the problem is that in these like large neural networks, we don't really know how the network is arriving at a particular solution because it works in such a big distributed manner. And so that makes it really, really difficult to be confident that your network is not like paying attention to something that you don't want it to pay attention to. And so this is also still like an ongoing topic of research. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kai, for speaking, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.